I don't know why, but on the Super Nintendo, I really do expect games to have a proper intro. Blaster Master 2 doesn't really have one. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Let's Play Blaster Master 2. Before we get into the game, I'd actually recommend customizing the controls to whatever you feel is most comfortable for you with the Genesis controller, and also raising the amount of credits you have per continue, because it's pretty easy to die in this game. So, compared to Blaster Master 1, just getting right into the game, this game isn't so much a semi-free roam exploration-based game with two gameplay styles like the first one was, as it is more so a more linear platformer with those two gameplay styles still somewhat intact. For the most part, you're going to be side-scrolling all the same, though, including ourselves here in the S.O.P.H.I.A, which isn't the same S.O.P.H.I.A from the first game. More on that when I read the plot synopsis later on, though we are still playing as Jason from the first game. A bit weird to put the sequel to an NES game on the Sega Genesis, yes, but sometimes that decision wasn't always the easiest thing to do, and also, let's be honest, the 90s had some strange ideas as it was, including just putting Ed.1 into the game. Now, like in Master Blaster 1, the S.O.P.H.I.A can aim in 8 directions, but between its acceleration and how picky it can be for when it wants to just point straight up and diagonally, the S.O.P.H.I.A is definitely the harder mode to control in this game, especially because you bounce up, down, and sideways off of any given wall with the momentum that you can build up just by walking around. And you also take a lot of damage very quickly in this game. Your health is much lower in general, I feel, although sometimes bosses are a bit kinder for how much damage they do to you. Thankfully, throughout the level, you can find just about any given power-up you need. Hearts are health, stars are 1-ups, and anything that looks like it's within a bubble is a various sub-weapon, which you can use right off the bat in this game as long as you have the ammunition. You got the usual triple missiles, homing missiles, the lightning power-ups back in this game, but it doesn't do just a bit of lightning below you like it did in Blaster Master 1. In this game, it actively shoots 4 shots out around the diagonals of you. And then there's a shield that completely makes you invincible to all attacks. By pressing, I believe it's down and C from memory, you'd leave the S.O.P.H.I.A in just Jason, and Jason kind of sucks. Fall damage is in the game, so you want to make sure you climb down every ladder as painstakingly slowly as you can, because if you fall too far too fast, you die instantly. When you're as Jason, you have the same controls as the S.O.P.H.I.A, just that you're slower and you're a bit more limited in terms of rate of fire. Your main goal in every single stage, though, is to find 2 mini-bosses and then leave the stage. Each of the mini-bosses has an item that is in some regards either a power-up or a key, and then reach the end of the stage. And the first boss fight is this little worm. It crawls back and forth, eventually crawling up a little bit to fire off a couple projectiles at you that can bounce around the floor. When it's holding itself up like that is when you need to shoot it, because its underbelly is its soft spot there in order to do some damage. The more damage you do to a boss fight in this game, the more red and quicker the boss moves, but the damage it deals doesn't really change, although how it attacks can later on. My best advice for this first boss, stay as far away as you can and jump over it while it's crawling to potentially dodge some of its attacks, because it, I think, always fires straight ahead of itself. I think the further on it gets an HP, it can also start firing worms that crawl along the floor pretty quickly. Yeah, it does, but those, I think, can be destroyed just by walking away from them. And that's the first boss down, and for beating it, it's going to drop this. It increases your rate of fire. That's the only increase to your weapon you're basically getting in the game, so get used to this increase of rate of fire. I should note, by the way, the way you enter doors in this game isn't just by pressing up or down into them, it's pressing up and A, which is really awkward. And it's weird that the NES game that had less buttons did that better somehow. Now, while the levels are generally more linear, they're still pretty dangerous because sometimes enemies are semi-random spawns. And additionally, checkpoints are kind of sparse in them. Boss fights are checkpoints, yes, but outside of that, I think if you die in the open world, quote-unquote open world segments with the S.O.P.H.I.A, you go back to the start of the stage in most instances, even if you cleared a mini-boss, but I believe the mini-boss itself is saved as defeated. The main reason you want to get that gun, because it's required by the way, is because it allows you to destroy these blocks. It's the Crusher beam from the earlier games, and the later games more or less. So now let's look at the manual and see exactly why we're here. It's been 4 years since Jason's encounters with the plutonium boss and the radioactive mutants under the Earth. His only reminder of the incident is S.O.P.H.I.A, the vehicle he used to stop them, which he has hidden in an abandoned barn. During a ferocious thunderstorm late one night, Jason is awakened to find lightning bolts striking the ground near the barn. After watching the lightning for some time, he saw it transform into a horrible being. Another bolt of lightning struck the house and caused the ceiling to crumble, knocking Jason unconscious. When Jason woke up, the S.O.P.H.I.A was in pieces and the parts he had collected from his first dealings with the mutant bosses were missing, hence why we're notably underpowered compared to how we were at the end of the first game. Before we continue off the plot, though, time for the second mini-boss. It's a bee. It flies around, generally sitting a decent distance away from you, firing its own little globs of honey at you. The best strategy, at least at this point, is to just stand directly below it and fire directly up at it. Yeah, you'll take a lot of hits in doing this, but if you have enough health, you'll outpace its damage, no problem. Usually, you can only beat the stages in this game by going one direct pathway, so you'll always have the exact same stuff when you get to certain boss fights, and because of that, one strategy is all you need. And for beating that boss, we get a key. We need that key to open certain locked doors, by certain I mean exactly 2, at the very bottom of this first stage. Going back to the plot, though, little does Jason know that there are more lightning beings where the first one came from, and they're planning to destroy the Earth. The beings started digging towards the Earth's core in order to shift the planet's weight off its axis, leading to total annihilation. The parts from S.O.P.H.I.A are being used to create a robotic army to assist the beings in accomplishing their mission. How a Worm and Bumblebee are robotic army members, I do not know. Now, Jason must stop them, but he won't make it without the help of S.O.P.H.I.A. Since he can't recover the parts, he decided to redesign it to better prepare himself for the ordeal facing him. After 29 days, specifically, S.O.P.H.I.A was completely rebuilt and ready for battle. Remembering where he saw the being's footsteps, Jason jumped in his vehicle and headed towards the mountains where the challenge begins. You know, given this, at least they give an explanation of some sort to why we're completely underpowered in this game compared to the end of the first one. Because Metroid didn't do that in any real substantial way until Fusion. And Fusion was probably the best explanation we got of it until Dread, admittedly. Which, oh, that's a little rough, but oh well. Kind of like it when they tell you, at least some regards, how you lose your stuff. Now, the admitted problem with the S.O.P.H.I.A portions of the game, outside of some of the control, is the S.O.P.H.I.A is pretty large. And admittedly, I think it takes up a healthy amount of the screen for what they would want to do. The problem with that also lies in how big some of the enemies are and how small their projectiles are, but how easy it still is to hit a lot of them. Because it's very easy to get blindsided by something if you're not paying attention. And now for this! Blaster Master 2 has 3 different styles of gameplay. It has the side-scrolling Jason segments, the side-scrolling S.O.P.H.I.A stuff, and top-down, almost like classic Capcom arcade-styled shooter sections. The way these work, and I did admittedly change some of my controls for this, is you press 2 of the face buttons to rotate the S.O.P.H.I.A's cannon around, and the third to fire. Your goal is just to reach the end of the little labyrinth we have here, and then, well, you're done with the stage. The stages in this game end rather unceremoniously. And because there's no real backtracking here, these are closer to proper platforming stages than they are the semi-Metroid structure that Blaster Master 1 had. And admittedly, I feel Blaster Master 2 kind of falls apart from the outset because of the different structure. The stages are very predictable in terms of what you're going to be doing next, even if you don't know what you're getting ahead of, what's ahead of you, rather. But I feel the lack of the proper exploration really harms the game in some regards, because the stages are relatively tiny, and there's not many options of where you can go at any specific moment in time. Admittedly, you can explore on a blind playthrough a little bit, but you'll come across very quickly if you just, say, avoid the one area you need to, say, leave the S.O.P.H.I.A and do the Jason thing alone in. Like, you'll find the place where you need to put the key that you get from the boss fight, so to speak, even if it's not explicitly a key. And I'm not a fan of this game's level design because of that. With that said, another thing that the top-down sections have, which is a slight reference to something the first game did and the Zero Trilogy does in its top-down segments, there are sometimes destructible objects that aren't enemies in the areas. And if you shoot those, sometimes they'll contain power-ups like in the main game, so to speak. However, those are just pure power-ups, unlike the Zero Trilogy in the original game. Whereas in those games, you get a power-up, and say if you get hit, you lose it a little bit, or you at least lose some power. In this, there are things like slows down your tank, speeds up your tank, speeds up your rate of fire, slows down your rate of fire. Invincibility, health. Because it is pretty good in the case you're taking a lot of damage. If you ever see squares and blocks like you see on the right side of the screen right now, go over to them and destroy them. There's at least a decent chance they'll drop. With that said, I do mean chance, because barring, I think, 1 or 2 occasions where they're just in the level design anyway, they are random with when they drop. And I think sometimes even enemies can drop them, but that's exceedingly rare. A big rude part about these stages is that it's very quick to take damage. Honestly, one of my biggest problems with this game, period, is that S.O.P.H.I.A and Jason do not have enough invincibility frames, I feel, for how fast enemies can fire. And also, stages just sort of end like that. Admittedly, technically Blaster Master 1 and the other games do that, where you beat a boss fight and then you leave the area. But because of this game's more linear structure, I feel they could have just changed the placements of boss fights and power-ups to be slightly... How do I explain this? Say you would fight the first boss fight to get the Crusher Beam in this game. And then the second boss fight's at the end of the stage, that would have been more comfortable for me. Say you just find the key behind some Crusher blocks. That would have been a way to make the exploration in this game closer to what the original game had. And not to say the Blaster Master 1 was perfect. Oh god, no. Blaster Master 1 had a lot of problems between the continue system and, admittedly, some of the exploration being, levels of weird. This is a case where, in a way, it's similar to Zelda 2, admittedly, where because there was only the one game at that point, experimentation was slightly required, but I feel they missed the mark in making a sequel because of the way they did it in this instance. Because Zelda 2, for instance, and Mega Man 2, well, not so much Mega Man 2, Mario 2, they're still an adventure game. They're still a platformer, just with different mechanics. This loses a key genre that the original had in its transition, and I don't like that. But I'm not going to harp on that the entire time, because I had to do that in the credits, clearly. Also, a weird thing in this game, water damages the S.O.P.H.I.A, but only sometimes. Namely, water falls in this stage damage the S.O.P.H.I.A, because what it technically is in the game's programming is just blue lava. In later stages, and by that I mean one later stage, water will not damage you. What still will forever damage you is water droplets, and these are some of the most annoying enemies in the game because they're infinite. You can't get rid of them. And they're very fast, and there is a pattern to how they drop down, but it's inconsistent enough that you don't want to deal with it. Enemy placements in the game are relatively consistent, but there are times where there's a bit of a Mega Man syndrome going on in this game, where if you scroll slightly off screen, they respawn. Additionally, enemies will respawn upon entering and exiting a mini-boss or a door. So if you come back to a previous area of the map again, they're going to be back. And that can be rough, but at the same time, that also means they might be able to drop something like a sub-weapon power-up or, in some cases, health. Now, my history with this game is... Whereas the first game I was introduced to by my brother, the later Blaster Master games I found just by looking around, and this one's the biggest case of that, honestly. Because I think I saw, like, Blasting Again and the one on WiiWare just kind of while exploring YouTube. This one I think I only saw on like a wiki or something. And admittedly, there's a good reason for that. It's probably my least favorite Blaster Master, and it's easily the least Blaster Master game in the series, barring the one on Game Boy that was a different game series anyway before being named Blaster Master. Either way, we're on to the first boss of Stage 2 here. It's a tank that moves back and forth, firing projectiles in two cross-shaped patterns. One shoots in the cardinal directions, the other in the intercardinal. The more you damage it, the redder it gets, the faster it gets, the usual. That's going to apply for every boss fight moving forward. Best strategy for this, stand on the very far left or right, and just hold that shoot button and jump every now and then to dodge the cardinal direction fires east or west. And for beating it, we get armor. In particular, that I believe is referred to as Insulated Armor in the manual. It doesn't increase your defense, from my knowledge, by the way, with big backtracks in the stage. I am going to be fast-forwarding them. What the Insulated Armor technically does is just protects you from electric attacks. And by that I mean exactly one electric hazard that if you tried to enter before, I believe would have been instant kill later on in the stage. It's just a key to a door. Which, technically speaking, in Metroid-likes in the first Blaster Master, every power-up was a key to some sort of door. But in this, I feel it's a lot more direct in being that than it was in the first game. Because in the first game, usually the power-ups also had some sort of other purpose, like helping you get around rooms easier, powering up your weapons. In this, it's just a direct key. And I don't mind having to grab keys. In fact, I kind of admire this game for just having outright keys. But in, like, this case, it's very dire. With that said, I do like this game's soundtrack, albeit it is probably one of the most foremost cases of Genesis twang that immediately comes to mind when I think of this sound chip. Also, we are coming up right now on the keyhole. See that electricity? If you entered it before, I believe it's instant kill. It might just do damage to you, but you wouldn't be able to pass through it. Now that we have the Insulated Armor, we can just pass right through it. It's just a door that we got a key to. And now we have another lengthy segment where we just have to platform as Jason. Admittedly, this is something I like that this game does more than Blaster Master 1, because Blaster Master 1, you never really wanted to be out of the S.O.P.H.I.A unless you absolutely had to be. And technically that's true in this game's case as well. But this game does more interesting things, I feel, when you're outside of S.O.P.H.I.A than when the first game did. Outside of the lack of the Jason alone top-down missions. And admittedly, I do find it interesting that this is something that Blaster Master Zero as an entire trilogy would later do, because they do a lot more interesting with Jason out of the mech than the original game did as well. And it's interesting because of that to see how the series evolved as it went through, even as it traded developers, sort of. Like, as we get to the later games, like, I'll get to Zero 2 eventually, I'll get to Blasting again, I'll probably get to the WiiWare one as well. The series has a distinct through line with how its gameplay mechanics evolve. Whether or not it combines the lore of the Japanese game to the US game is something else entirely. And now we're on to the second boss fight of Stage 2, another tank. But whereas the first one was a projectile-based one, this one, starting off at least, just has a little drill hand. When it gets close to you, it tries to stab you with it, and admittedly, this is kind of a hard boss to dodge at first because it moves at such a consistent rate that you'll get very little time to shoot it until you have to actively dodge. Sometimes the drill feels like it hesitates a second before firing, but you also want to be careful about dodging it because the hitbox isn't exactly just the drill, it's more like a rectangle around the drill. And you take a lot of damage, and it's really easy to die in this game, by the way. And god damn, it's a pretty brutal death, too. Christ. Whenever I die in this game, because I will be dying a decent bit, I'm just going to jump cut to where I died. Sometimes with bosses, with the rough amount of health they had, I kind of would wish the games had boss health bars, and I'm glad the Master Zero games do. But later on in this fight, it does change. Phase 2, it just starts firing bombs out of the left or right side of it, depending on where you are. Best strategy, stand slightly below the platform to the right or the left of the tank and just fire into it. You'll get hit every now and then, but because of the more exaggerant pattern of it moving left to right, the more damage you do to it, it gets harder and harder for it to hit you. So the second half of this fight is honestly easier than the first half. And for beating this boss, we get almost another literal key. We're going to get a drill attachment to the S.O.P.H.I.A. This is used to destroy certain blocks, but unlike the Crusher Beam, which is always active, you need to actively swap to this, and it's only used for destroying the blocks. It's not really good for attacking enemies because it's not an attack. It's just almost a movement upgrade in a way. The way you switch items in this game, this goes for sub-weapons in the S.O.P.H.I.A. and eventually Jason as well, is you press the start button and you're sent to a menu where you can select things from there. The menu is relatively straightforward, telling you how much you have of any given sub-weapon and what you're selecting. Admittedly, it can be a bit sticky with how it wants to work, because the menu is split up into, I believe it's 3 or 4 different vertical segments, each dedicated to a certain subcategory. The far left is sub-weapons. The middle, I believe, is certain movement upgrades for the S.O.P.H.I.A, and the right is even more specific movement upgrades. In most cases, you don't want to toggle any of them off, The only times you really do is when they have, say, a fuel meter of their own. And to show it off, as we get over here, you press the start button. You go over to the middle one, you select the drill, you go through, immediately go back to the beam or whatever is in the middle there because you're not going to want the drill to attack because it doesn't really work. And now we have these crushers, and this is a case where you can really see this game's minor hitbox issues. More or less, if something is an enemy or a hazard, every bit of it is a hitbox, even if it just touching the side of it shouldn't hurt you, rather. It's like the whole, why does touching a side of a spike in Mega Man instant kill you? Frankly, just because it's dated. Thankfully, there's only a few cases where I feel the hitboxes get that annoying. And that's, we're not seeing another one, I believe, until like stage 4. And now for this stage's top-down segment. That there is actually a power-up I forgot about. The B stands for bomb. It kills every enemy on screen. Those can be useful, but it's not like bombs in, say, the Gradius sense where you get to use them whenever you want. They're used the moment you collect them. And the problem with that is sometimes there's going to be a bomb that drops from an enemy or a rock when there's no enemies on screen. Some enemies do have more HP in these segments too, so they'd be more useful to be used there, but you don't get to save them. The biggest problem with this game, I wonder, comes down to how it worked in development, because I don't think we know too much about this game's development. It makes me wonder if this game was either rushed or was constrained in some way from their ambitions on the Genesis. I'll have to look into it, see if I can find more in between parts. I doubt I will be able to, because I did some decent research from memory when I recorded the footage for this about half a month ago. But I'll look more into it again between parts, just to be certain. It's just weird in a way to see a sequel to a game that was pretty ambitious for what the original hardware was be more limiting, because we haven't had too many cases of that, at least for games of this type usually. They're usually like the Metroid likes, the search actions as they're starting to be called more commonly now, because especially the pre-release stuff for Metroid Dread started spreading that term around a lot more here in the States. Usually they refine the controls and level design in such a way that it's easier to explore. This game limits you more. It's a weird case of inverse evolution, so to speak. Also, if you're wondering what that beeping is, I believe that's the game telling me I'm at low health, but I also think it might be certain enemies turning around. And the reason I say I believe is I've never been too sure, because it usually happens when both things are on screen at the same time. Admittedly, that is something I wish this game had, a bigger health bar, not only in terms of the amount of damage you can take, but also it's just generally small and in a very awkward place for the type of game this is. I think it only really works down there in the bottom left corner for the Jason boss fights. When you're exploring the stage, I think it's a bit of an awkward placement. And that's also a problem I have with God of War 2018, which does something very similar for its health bar. It's very out of the way. And I get it, some people like minimalistic UIs, I like things to be as readable as possible, but that's a topic for another day. But with that, and me entering this door, I'm gonna need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 2, we're gonna be continuing on into stage 3, and I believe stage 4, and seeing how much further we can get towards the core of the Earth. See you guys then.